Marry me. Lena Burke nearly choked on her coffee. She stared at the man sitting across from her in the corner booth of their favorite cafe, her best friend, Caleb Montgomery. His expression was unreadable, calm, confident, like he hadn't just dropped the most insane proposal she'd ever heard. "Excuse me." Lena finally managed, setting down her cup before she spilled it all over herself. Caleb leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. "I need a fiancé," he said, his voice steady, like this was just another one of their usual debates over where to get takeout. "And you're the only person I trust." Lena let out a breathless laugh. "Oh, that makes total sense. Sure, Caleb, let me just clear my schedule for our fake engagement. What is this, some kind of prank?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm serious, Lena." That was the problem. He was always serious. Caleb Montgomery was the kind of man who never did anything without a plan, never said anything without meaning it. And right now, he was looking at her like he truly expected her to say yes to this ridiculous idea. She shook her head, trying to process. Why in the world would you need a fake fiancé? Caleb exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "My grandfather is pushing me to settle down. He's threatening to cut me off if I don't prove I can be responsible." "Cut you off," Lena repeated. That was when she finally put the pieces together. Caleb was rich. Not just well off, but the kind of rich that came with high-rise offices, tailored suits, and a last name that carried weight in business circles. He never flaunted it, never made her feel like she was any different because she wasn't born into wealth. But now, for the first time, it was glaringly obvious. "Lena," Caleb said, his voice softer now, "you know I don't care about the money, but my company, everything I've built, depends on my grandfather's approval. If he pulls his support, I could lose everything, and if he thinks I'm some reckless bachelor, that's exactly what he'll do." Lena crossed her arms. "So instead of finding an actual girlfriend, your solution is me." Caleb gave her a small smile. "You're the only person I can trust to play along without losing their mind." She rolled her eyes. "Flattering," he leaned back. "Think about it, it wouldn't be forever, just long enough to convince him I'm serious about settling down. A few months, tops." Lena stared at him, her heart pounding. This was insane, completely, utterly insane. But Caleb had been her best friend for years. He was the one who had helped her move into her tiny apartment when she had nothing but 2 suitcases and a battered coffee maker. He was the one who showed up with takeout when she was having a bad day. He was the one person in her life who had never let her down, and now he was asking for her help. "You really think this will work?" she asked, her voice quiet. Caleb nodded. "I do." She took a deep breath, knowing she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. "Fine," she said. "I'll be your fake fiancé." Lena expected things to feel the same between them after she agreed. After all, it was just a favor for Caleb. But the moment he slipped a diamond ring onto her finger, an actual, stunning, probably absurdly expensive diamond, everything shifted. "You could have gone with something smaller," she muttered, staring at the way the stone caught the light. Caleb smirked. "If we're going to sell this, we have to do it right. Sell it right." Which was why, a week later, Lena found herself walking into an upscale restaurant on Caleb's arm, her stomach twisting with nerves. "This is it," he murmured as they approached the private dining room where his grandfather was waiting. "Just follow my lead." Lena forced a smile, gripping his hand a little tighter. They had spent the past few days going over their story, memorizing details that would make their engagement seem believable. But no amount of preparation could stop her pulse from racing as they stepped inside. The man seated at the head of the table was exactly what Lena had imagined. Silver hair, piercing gaze, an air of authority that made her spine straighten on instinct. "Grandfather," Caleb greeted smoothly, "this is Lena, my fiancée." Lena extended her hand, grateful Caleb had warned her about the firm handshake she should expect. "A pleasure to meet you, sir," she said, keeping her voice steady. His grandfather studied her for a long moment before nodding. We'll see if that remains true. Dinner was a tense affair. Lena did her best to answer questions naturally, but it was clear Mr. Montgomery wasn't convinced. You've been together for how long? He asked at one point, his gaze sharp. Almost a year, Caleb answered without hesitation. Lena smiled. He proposed after a trip to the coast. It was spur of the moment, Caleb cut in. But when you know, you know. His grandfather's eyes narrowed. And yet, I've never heard of you until now. Lena's stomach twisted, but Caleb remained calm. We wanted to keep things private for a while. You know how the media can be. His grandfather studied them for a long moment before finally nodding. Very well, but if this is real, then I expect to see a wedding date set soon. Lena nearly choked on her wine. A wedding date. Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. Of course, we'll start planning immediately. Lena barely held in her shock until they were finally outside, away from his grandfather's prying eyes. A wedding, Caleb, she hissed. That was not part of the deal. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't expect him to push for it this soon, Lena groaned. This is getting out of control. Caleb turned to her, his expression unreadable. We'll figure it out. But as she looked up at him, her heart still racing from the night's events, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something much more complicated than she had ever bargained for. Lena barely slept that night. The moment she shut her eyes, her mind replayed every second of the dinner with Caleb's grandfather, the sharp glint in the old man's eyes, the way he had dissected every word she spoke, and worst of all, the expectation that they would now be planning a wedding. A wedding? She stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, the diamond ring on her finger catching the dim glow of the streetlights outside. This had escalated far beyond what she had signed up for. By the time the sun crept through her window, she had made up her mind. She was going to tell Caleb that this was too much. They needed to find another way. But when she arrived at his office later that morning, the situation had already spiraled further out of control. The receptionist barely glanced at her before waving her through. She strode past the sleek glass walls, her heels clicking against the marble floors, until she reached Caleb's office. The door was already open, and she froze in the doorway at the sight of a woman sitting across from Caleb, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Lena, Caleb said, standing. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, something off. The woman turned, assessing Lena with a gaze that left nothing unnoticed. Her tailored suit was pristine, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. She exuded power. Lena Burke, the woman said, her tone measured. I've heard a lot about you. Lena forced a polite smile, even as unease settled in her stomach. I hope it's all good things. The woman didn't return the smile. That remains to be seen. Caleb cleared his throat. Lena, this is Victoria Langley. She's my grandfather's legal advisor. Lena's pulse quickened. Legal advisor, that couldn't be good. As I was just explaining to Caleb, Victoria continued, his grandfather wants assurances. A legally binding agreement that ensures this engagement isn't just a fleeting arrangement. Lena's stomach dropped. A what? Victoria pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the desk. A marriage contract, signed and notarized before the wedding. Lena's heart pounded so loudly she almost couldn't hear anything else. You can't be serious, she said, her voice breathless. Victoria merely arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Mr. Montgomery is a cautious man. He won't allow his grandson to make a mockery of this engagement. If this is real, then there should be no problem putting it in writing. Lena turned to Caleb, expecting him to look just as panicked as she felt. Instead, his face was unreadable, his hands clasped together on the desk. You're actually considering this? She asked, disbelief lacing her words. Caleb exhaled slowly. I don't have a choice, Lena. The weight of those words settled between them. Victoria stood, smoothing out her blazer. I'll give you both time to review the terms, but know this: Mr. Montgomery is expecting a signed contract by the end of the week. She turned on her heel and strode out, leaving only the sound of the door clicking shut behind her. Lena stared at Caleb. "Tell me you're not going to sign that." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Lena, Caleb," she cut him off, her voice rising. "This was supposed to be fake. Now there's a legal contract, a wedding date." "How much further is this going to go?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something flickered in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. "I know this is a lot," he admitted. "But I swear, I will make sure you don't get trapped in anything you don't want." Lena folded her arms, trying to ignore the way her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "You're asking me to sign a contract obligating me to marry you, Caleb. How am I supposed to be okay with that?" He pushed the folder toward her. "Look at the terms before you decide." She hesitated, then slowly flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the contents, each line making her stomach twist tighter. The agreement stipulated that their marriage would last a minimum of 1 year before an amicable divorce. Financial compensation was included enough to ensure she wouldn't suffer any losses. There were clauses for privacy, media appearances, even stipulations about maintaining the appearance of a loving couple. Lena's fingers trembled slightly as she closed the folder. "This is insane." Caleb leaned forward. "I know, but it's the only way to convince my grandfather. If I don't do this, everything I've built could disappear overnight." She hated how conflicted she felt. Caleb had been there for her through everything. If their positions were reversed, would he hesitate to help her? She let out a slow breath. "You're really sure this is the only option?" He nodded. "I wouldn't ask you if I had another choice." Lena stared at the contract, her mind spinning. Then, before she could overthink it, she grabbed a pen. "If I sign this, you better promise me one thing," she said, meeting his gaze. "Anything," Caleb said immediately. "When this is over, we go back to normal, no complications, no mess." Something unreadable flickered in his expression, but he nodded. "Agreed." Lena inhaled sharply, then pressed the pen to the paper, and just like that, she sealed her fate. Lena had expected the engagement announcement to be a quiet affair, something handled with a simple social media post or a discreet mention among Caleb's business associates. She should have known better. The morning after she signed the contract, her phone exploded with notifications. Her name was suddenly attached to headlines she never imagined seeing. Caleb Montgomery's surprise engagement. Who is Lena Burke? She stared at the screen in horror as article after article dissected her life, her job, her past, every detail laid out for the world to see. By the time she made it to Caleb's penthouse, she was fuming. "You didn't warn me about this," she snapped the second she stepped inside. Caleb, who had been standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with his phone in hand, barely had time to react before she thrust her screen toward him. His eyes flicked over the headlines before he sighed. "I should have known they'd dig into everything this fast." "You think," she shot back. "They're treating me like some mystery woman who came out of nowhere. Do you have any idea how insane this is?" He set his phone down and crossed the room, his expression unreadable. "I'll handle it." Lena let out a disbelieving laugh. "You'll handle it? The media is treating me like some gold-digging nobody, Caleb. They're picking apart my job, my apartment, my entire life like I'm some fraud." His jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we need to control the narrative. If we act like we have nothing to hide, they'll move on." She folded her arms. "And how do you suggest we do that?" He hesitated for only a second before answering. "We stage a public appearance, a real one. No press statements, no rehearsed responses, just us in front of the world, proving this engagement is real." Lena nearly groaned. "So what? We just parade around town looking ridiculously in love?" A small smirk tugged at his lips. "Something like that." She rolled her eyes but knew there was no way out. If they didn't take control of the situation, the speculation would only get worse. "Fine," she muttered, "but I'm not playing some clueless fiancé who stares at you like you hung the moon." Caleb's smirk deepened. "I'd never ask you to." She ignored the way her stomach flipped at that. The event was a charity gala, one of those high-profile affairs where the guest list consisted of CEOs, socialites, and celebrities. The moment Lena stepped out of the car, the flash of cameras nearly blinded her. Caleb was at her side in an instant, his hand resting lightly at her waist as he guided her inside. "You okay?" He murmured near her ear. She exhaled slowly. "Just trying not to trip in these heels." His chuckle was low, warm. "You're doing great." The words shouldn't have affected her, but something about the way he said them sent a strange warmth through her chest. They moved through the crowd effortlessly, Caleb introducing her to people she had only ever read about in business magazines. She smiled, nodded, and played the role of the adoring fiancé, holding his hand, laughing at his dry humor, leaning into his touch when the cameras were near. But as the night went on, something strange happened. She wasn't just pretending anymore. Every time Caleb's fingers brushed against hers, her pulse stuttered. Every time he looked at her with that quiet intensity, her stomach flipped. And when they stepped onto the dance floor, his hand settling against the small of her back as he led her effortlessly across the room, she forgot just for a moment that any of this was fake. "You're staring," he murmured. Lena blinked, realizing too late that she had been. She cleared her throat. "I'm just impressed. Never thought you'd be this smooth on a dance floor." His lips quirked. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Burke." The way he said her name made her breath hitch. She needed to get a grip. But as the night wore on, it became harder and harder to ignore the undeniable shift between them. And when they finally stepped outside, away from the flashing cameras and the scrutinizing eyes, Lena realized something terrifying. She wasn't just playing a role anymore. She was falling. For real. Lena wasn't sure when the lines between pretense and reality had blurred, but now they were non-existent. Every glance Caleb gave her felt weighted, every touch lingered just a second too long. She told herself it was for the sake of appearances, that they were merely keeping up the act, but deep down she knew better. She was in love with him. The realization settled in her chest like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The next morning, she arrived at Caleb's penthouse to discuss the next steps in their engagement charade, but the moment he opened the door, she knew something was wrong. His usual composed expression was absent, replaced by something unreadable. She stepped inside, her pulse quickening when he shut the door behind her. The silence stretched between them until Caleb finally spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, like he was debating every word before he said it. His posture was tense, his usual confidence giving way to something almost hesitant. Lena felt her stomach twist. She had never seen him like this before. It wasn't until he took a step closer that she realized how close they already were. His presence was overwhelming, his scent familiar in a way that made her ache. Then, without warning, he reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers like he was waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. His voice was rougher now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it before. Lena's breath hitched. This wasn't part of the plan, none of this was, but she didn't care. The space between them disappeared in an instant. The moment his lips met hers, every carefully constructed barrier shattered. It wasn't just a kiss, it was everything they had been holding back, everything unsaid finally breaking free. Her hands found their way to the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer as he deepened the kiss, his fingers threading through her hair like he had been waiting for this just as desperately as she had. When they finally parted, they were both breathless. Lena searched his face, looking for hesitation, but there was none. This was real, too real, and that terrified her more than anything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, she whispered the only thing that made sense. The words hung between them, fragile but undeniable. Caleb exhaled sharply, his grip on her tightening like he was afraid to let go. There was no turning back now. Lena barely had time to process what had happened before Caleb's phone rang, shattering the moment between them. He hesitated, his gaze still locked on hers, but then exhaled sharply and stepped back to answer it. She used the moment to gather her thoughts to convince herself that the kiss hadn't meant as much as it did. But her heart was still pounding, her skin still humming from his touch. She needed air. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the window, looking out at the city skyline. The view stretched endlessly, but it wasn't enough to steady her. Caleb's voice was low as he spoke into the phone, his tone clipped. Whatever was being said, it wasn't good. When he hung up, the tension in the room thickened. He ran a hand through his hair before finally speaking. Lena turned to face him, startled by the sudden shift in his expression. His jaw was tight, his usual control giving way to something almost desperate. Lena's breath caught. A week. That wasn't enough time. But before she could respond, Caleb stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Lena's pulse stuttered. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of it filled the room. And then, just like that, the choice was made. The next few days were a blur of preparations. Wedding arrangements that should have taken months were condensed into hours. There were dress fittings, venue selections, and endless meetings with planners who worked at lightning speed to make everything perfect. Lena barely had time to breathe. But through it all, Caleb was there. Every time she started to feel overwhelmed, he would reach for her hand, grounding her. Every time she doubted whether she could go through with this, he would give her a look, a quiet reassurance that told her she wasn't alone in this. And with each passing moment, the reality of what they were about to do settled deeper into her bones. This wasn't just a game anymore. The night before the wedding, Lena stood on the balcony of Caleb's penthouse, staring out at the city below. The cool breeze did little to calm her racing thoughts. She heard him step outside before she saw him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Caleb broke the silence. Lena turned to face him, her heart pounding. His voice was rough with something she couldn't quite name. Her breath caught, and in that moment she knew she had already fallen, and tomorrow she was going to marry him. The wedding day arrived with a kind of surreal inevitability. From the moment Lena opened her eyes, the weight of everything pressed down on her chest. She was about to stand in front of a room full of people and vow herself to Caleb Montgomery. The morning passed in a flurry of preparation. The makeup artist worked diligently while the stylist pinned her hair into an elegant updo. The dress, a custom-made ivory silk gown with delicate lace along the sleeves, fit like a dream. It was the kind of dress a woman wore when she was in love, when she was stepping into forever. Except this wasn't forever. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. By the time she was escorted to the grand doors of the ceremony hall, her pulse was a steady, relentless drum. The venue was breathtaking, all white roses and soft candlelight, the kind of wedding that belonged in magazines. But none of it compared to the sight of Caleb standing at the altar, waiting for her. His eyes locked onto hers the second she appeared, and for a moment it was as if everything else faded. She walked toward him, her steps deliberate, her breath unsteady. When her hand finally met his, warmth spread through her fingers, grounding her. The officiant spoke, but she barely heard the words. She could only focus on Caleb, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his thumb brushed against the side of her palm, the quiet intensity in his gaze. Then came the vows. Caleb spoke first, his voice resolute, the words spoken not just for the audience but for her. Her throat tightened. When it was her turn, she forced herself to speak the words she had rehearsed, but they didn't feel rehearsed at all. They felt real, too real. And then, before she could process what was happening, the officiant declared them husband and wife. Caleb lifted her veil, and for the second time in her life, his lips met hers. But this time it wasn't an act. The reception was a dazzling affair, a swirl of congratulations, champagne, and music. But through it all, Lena felt like she was moving in a haze. Every time she looked at Caleb, something in her chest tightened. People approached them, offering warm wishes. His grandfather gave a nod of approval, something that once would have felt like a victory. But now, all Lena could think about was the fact that this wasn't a game anymore. At some point in the evening, Caleb led her onto the dance floor. The moment his arms wrapped around her, the world shrank to just the two of them. They swayed in silence, the weight of everything pressing between them. Then, in a voice so quiet that only she could hear, Caleb spoke, her breath caught. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign that he was playing a role. But there was no mask, no careful pretense, only honesty. Her heart pounded. His grip on her tightened as if bracing himself. Lena's throat tightened, emotions swelling inside her. This was never supposed to happen, but it had, and there was no going back. By the time the night ended, Lena knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer pretending, and neither was he. The car ride back to the penthouse was silent, charged with something unspoken. When they arrived, Caleb reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She let him. Because for once, she wasn't afraid. She knew, without a doubt, that this was exactly where she was meant to be.